She thought she could control the neighborhood with threats and complaints. But when she called the cops on my wife over a locked barn door, she had no idea who she was messing with. 'Cause the woman she tried to humiliate isn't just my wife, she's the new police chief. Karen was about to learn that abusing power comes with a price. In the quiet, gated community where regulations mattered more than relationships, one person had crowned herself the ruler, Karen, with her clipboard smartphone. And an HOA manual that seemed more sacred to her than the law itself. She moved through the neighborhood like a warden in charge of a prison. Her presence wasn't just known, it was feared. Residents quickly learned that any deviation from her vision of perfection would earn a warning, fine, or worse, a summons to an HOA hearing. She thrived on authority, even though none had been officially granted to her beyond a volunteer HOA role. It wasn't her home she protected, it was her pride. She saw the neighborhood as her empire, and every front yard, mailbox, and driveway as subjects to govern. She measured grass with a ruler, critiqued paint colors that weren't on her pre-approved palette, and counted garbage bins left out past collection time. Her eyes never rested, and her mouth rarely stayed closed when there was an opportunity to assert control. For months, Karen had set her sights on our property. Unlike many others on the block who caved under her passive-aggressive suggestions, we didn't entertain her interference, and that irked her. Our home wasn't just a structure to hurt, it was defiance incarnate. What bothered her most wasn't our landscaping or paint, it was the large red barn that stood at the far edge of our property. A beautifully restored structure, it had stood there longer than most of the homes in the neighborhood. Legally grandfathered in, it was a piece of local history. But to Karen, it was an eyesore, an anomaly, a loophole she hadn't yet closed. We had recently locked the barn for renovations and safety. Karen didn't see it as responsible maintenance. She saw it as suspicious activity. From her upstairs window, she kept a close watch, whispering wild theories to whoever would listen. She told neighbors we might be hiding animals, storing hazardous chemicals, or using it for illegal business operations. Each theory became more ridiculous, but her conviction never wavered. To her, the truth was irrelevant. What mattered was asserting dominance. The barn became her obsession. She used drone footage, claiming it was for neighborhood safety. She even tried to peek through the cracks in the doors when she thought no one was watching. When we installed a padlock and signage warning against trespassing, Karen took it as a challenge. She printed HOA rules that didn't even apply to barns, and highlighted sections she hoped would intimidate us. She left these notes in our mailbox, slipped them under our doormat, and even taped one to the barn door like some medieval decree. But the real issue wasn't the barn. It was the fact that we had politely but firmly told her to mind her own business. To someone like Karen, that was unacceptable. Control was her currency, and she hated the idea of anyone resisting her self-imposed authority.
Her complaints
to the HOA board went nowhere. Her petitions for an emergency inspection of our barn were denied. The bylaws were clear. Our structure was compliant. Our permits were valid, and our renovation work was properly documented. Still, she wasn't done. Being proven wrong wasn't enough. She wanted to make us yield. So, she began building a narrative. She told other board members we had become hostile. She said we were uncooperative and raising red flags. She spread stories about unusual sounds coming from our property and exaggerated them until people started to believe them. Fear was her favorite tool, and she wielded it like a hammer. The barn was just a symbol. What she wanted was submission. When she realized she couldn't get the HOA to act, she decided to escalate beyond them. That's when she made the fateful decision. If she couldn't force compliance through regulations, she'd do it through law enforcement. She dialed the non-emergency police line, filed a complaint claiming there was suspicious and potentially dangerous activity taking place inside the barn, framed it as a public safety concern. She used phrases like community risk, unauthorized, storage, and non-cooperative homeowner. Her voice was filled with artificial concern, but her motivation was pure retaliation. Karen didn't care that her accusations had no basis. She believed that if officers arrived at our doorstep, it would be enough to shame us, enough to pressure us into opening that barn and proving ourselves. She didn't want justice. She wanted control. And in her mind, there was no way the system wouldn't support her. After all, she'd spent years manipulating it. What she didn't realize was that the power she was trying to weaponize didn't belong to her, it belonged to someone else now, in the very institution she tried to use. As a tool of harassment was about to expose just how powerless she really was. Karen had always preferred intimidation over conversation. While other HOA members occasionally tried to engage with homeowners in good faith, Karen skipped straight to ultimatums. Her communication style wasn't rooted in community, but in control. It began subtly notes in the mailbox, remarks at HOA meetings, gossip slipped into group chats. But once she decided someone was a problem, the pressure escalated fast. And we were now her prime target. When the barn remained closed, Karen shifted gears. A formal HOA violation notice arrived, filled with vague language about unpermitted structures, potential safety violations, and lack of community transparency. The irony was rich, considering that every claim was not only false, but already addressed during our property's permit review. Yet Karen didn't care about facts. Her goal was pressure. This was her chosen tactic. The notice wasn't even properly filed through the board. She had forged the format from previous documents, hoping the official tone would scare us into compliance. But it didn't. We responded with documentation permits, safety certifications, renovation plans, and copied the entire HOA board. Several members responded apologetically, clarifying that no such citation had been authorized. But Karen remained silent. She wasn't embarrassed. She was frustrated. Her bluff had been called, and now she was ready to play dirty. That same week, she began making personal visits. Dressed like a municipal inspector and carrying a clipboard, she knocked on our door 3 times in 4 days, demanding to inspect the barn. Each time she was turned away respectfully but firmly. She had no authority to enter our property. She wasn't part of any legal or code enforcement body. And most importantly, she wasn't welcome. Still, she pushed, her words sharper each time. You know, the longer you keep that place sealed, the more suspicious it looks, she muttered during her last visit. She was baiting us, hoping for a reaction she could twist into a justification. For further action, when she didn't get it, she resorted to threats. This time, not veiled behind HOA technicalities, but direct and personal. She warned us that things could get serious if we didn't cooperate with the neighborhoods. Safety expectations. She made comments like, "You don't want law enforcement involved, do you? And it's not worth the trouble you're inviting." It wasn't just about the barn anymore. It was about pride. Karen couldn't stomach the idea that someone in her orbit wasn't afraid of her. And if manipulation and fake notices didn't work, she was ready to escalate to something more serious, something public. She wanted us embarrassed. She wanted to force us to kneel in front of the very neighbors who had once seen her as the authority. But her grip was slipping, and she knew it. The only way to reclaim control was through spectacle. Her chance came sooner than expected. That weekend, a contractor dropped off supplies for the interior barn renovations, sealed paint buckets, and some new equipment. The truck was parked legally, and nothing about the delivery broke any rule. But Karen, watching from her second-story window like a sentry guarding a fortress, saw it as the perfect moment. She snapped photos, zoomed in on license plates, and filmed the contractor unloading. A false narrative was already forming in her mind. She was ready to deliver it to someone with a badge. The next day, she called the police. She didn't dial 911. Karen was calculated. She called the non-emergency line and described the barn as a potential storage site for hazardous chemicals and hinted at unpermitted commercial activity. She used vague, yet alarming terms, careful not to lie outright, but steering the officer on the phone toward the conclusion she wanted. It wasn't the first time she'd used law enforcement to intimidate someone, but this time she was convinced it would be the last straw. As she ended the call, she wore the same smirk. She always did when she thought she had one. She had filed the complaint. She had recorded her side of the story, and soon she believed squad cars would arrive. Her dream scenario was clear. Flashing lights, confused neighbors watching from their porches, officers knocking on our door. and the barn forced open, all orchestrated by her, all proving her supremacy. But what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was the new reality of our town's law enforcement structure. The leadership had changed recently, and not all residents had caught up with the news. The person responsible for processing non-emergency neighborhood complaints, overseeing on-site responses, and evaluating public nuisance claims was someone Karen hadn't considered in her plan. She assumed a random officer would show up, ask questions, and take her side out of convenience. Instead, her false report had triggered a chain of events that would lead her directly into a confrontation with authority, just not the kind she had expected. Karen believed she had finally cornered us. She saw herself as the enforcer of rules and the protector of the neighborhood. But the moment her complaint reached the desk of the person now in charge of responding to these matters, her illusion of control began to crumble. Her arrogance had blinded her. And now, the power she had tried to manipulate was about to answer her call with truth, justice, and a badge she didn't expect. Karen believed she had finally regained the upper hand. Filing the complaint gave her a renewed sense of power, as if she had pulled the right string and now waited for the marionettes of authority to dance to her tune. She expected results immediate, dramatic, and public. She envisioned a patrol car arriving, officers questioning us under suspicion, and, ultimately, our barn being forced open in front of an audience of curious neighbors. She believed this spectacle would reinstate her dominance. But what she didn't know was that her complaint hadn't reached just any responding officer. It had landed on the desk of the town's newly appointed police chief. What Karen failed to realize was that leadership had changed just weeks prior, and with that change came a shift in how community complaints were handled. The town, once lenient with frivolous calls from overzealous residents, had tightened procedures. And leading that charge of reform, discipline, and accountability was none other than my wife. Karen's complaint, framed as a community safety concern, followed all the right protocols on paper. But my wife was known for looking past surface details and identifying patterns. In this complaint fit a familiar pattern: vague accusations, no physical evidence, repeated targeting of the same address. A caller known by name among multiple residents for pushing HOA boundaries. My wife had already received 3 unrelated reports about Karen's behavior from others in the neighborhood since taking office. This new claim only reinforced what she was already piecing together: a pattern of harassment dressed up as civic concern. Despite the personal nature of the complaint, my wife didn't assign the case to another officer. She believed in transparency and accountability. And if someone was using law enforcement as a tool of intimidation, she wanted to address it directly and professionally. She reviewed the file, verified our property's permits and recent activity, and prepared to follow up not out of suspicion, but out of principle. Karen, meanwhile, remained oblivious. She waited at her window the next day, phone in hand, camera ready. She had even told a few neighbors to keep an eye out, hinting that something major was about to happen down the street. In her mind, this was justice in action. What she hadn't prepared for was who would be arriving, or how calmly that justice would present itself. When the patrol vehicle approached, Karen was already outside. She stood confidently near the edge of our driveway, arms crossed, wearing the smirk that had become her trademark. Her expectation was that she would lead the officers to the barn, provide her version of events, and oversee the outcome like a supervisor observing her subordinates. But her entire demeanor changed the moment my wife stepped out of the car, dressed in full uniform, badge gleaming, radio clipped, posture commanding. Recognition didn't strike immediately. Karen squinted, confused, processing what she was seeing. Then came the flicker of realization, and with it the panic. Face lost color, her body stiffened. Her voice, once sharp and self-assured, faltered into awkward stammering. Karen had unknowingly reported the wife of the town's police chief for a fabricated offense, and that chief had come in person to investigate. The moment hit her like a wave of cold reality. The person she had been threatening, targeting, and falsely accusing wasn't just a homeowner refusing to bow to her control. She was the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the entire municipality. Karen hadn't just crossed a line, she'd launched a personal campaign against someone who could now hold her accountable with authority. She couldn't intimidate or manipulate. My wife didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She approached, with the calm confidence of someone who had dealt with more serious threats, and had no patience for pettiness masquerading as concern. She listened to Karen's stumbling explanations, reviewed the supposed evidence, and asked measured questions. It quickly became clear to anyone observing, including the few neighbors who had peeked out of curiosity, that the issue wasn't the barn. It was Karen. The roles reversed instantly. Karen, once the self-styled enforcer of community standards, now stood in front of the real authority exposed. Her tactics, her tone, her intimidation, it all unraveled in the face of professional scrutiny. No more hiding behind HOA codes. No more fake notices. No more veiled threats. Just facts, policy, and consequences. What made it worse for her was that my wife didn't retaliate emotionally. She didn't mock or gloat. She treated Karen like any other citizen making a baseless complaint. That quiet professionalism cut deeper than any argument ever could. It sent a clear message. Power doesn't come from fear or control. It comes from integrity, truth, and earned respect. Karen tried to backpedal. She claimed she only called because she didn't know who else to contact. She insisted she was only trying to keep the neighborhood safe. But the excuses rang hollow. My wife recorded everything, documented the exchange, and left with a clear statement. The barn was compliant. The complaint was baseless, and any future misuse of emergency or non-emergency services could result in formal charges. For the first time, Karen was silent. Her voice, once the loudest in every room, had been silenced by the quiet power of real authority. She had tried to weaponize the land, ended up staring down its true face. After the confrontation with the police chief, my wife Karen's grip on the neighborhood began to loosen. The control she once exercised with smug confidence now faltered under the weight of her own miscalculated actions. Her plan to humiliate us had backfired spectacularly, but the real reckoning was only just beginning. The complaint she filed didn't just disappear. It became part of an official report. And that report initiated something Karen never anticipated: an internal review of her behavior as an HOA board member. Over the years, Karen had left a long trail of angry neighbors, petty disputes, and questionable enforcement tactics. File at the HOA office had grown thick with informal grievances and mails from residents, meeting transcripts, and community complaints that were never escalated because people were afraid to challenge her directly. She'd built her authority, not on legal standing, but on fear, manipulation, and intimidation. But now someone with actual authority was paying attention. My wife didn't stop at disproving Karen's baseless complaint. She submitted an official report to the HOA and the city's Neighborhood Relations Committee, detailing the history of harassment, the misuse of public resources, the potential liability the HOA faced if they continued allowing Karen to act unchecked. The report included timestamps, records of previous false complaints, and written testimonies from multiple residents who had been targeted or harassed. It was no longer just a neighborhood issue, it was a matter of public accountability. The HOA board, already aware of Karen's aggressive tactics, but unwilling to challenge her due to her dominant personality, found itself in an uncomfortable spotlight. Karen was no longer just a nuisance. She was now a liability. The police chief's involvement forced them to take the issue seriously. They called an emergency meeting not to back Karen, but to review the growing number of complaints about her abuse of power. Within a week, neighbors began speaking out. One by one, residents who had once stayed silent came forward. Some had stories of being fined for having wind chimes that violated noise rules. Others had been scolded for planting flowers outside of approved seasonal color palettes. Several mentioned being watched or photographed without consent. A young couple revealed how Karen had tried to block their home renovation project, claiming it would lower property values even though their plans had already been approved. The pattern was undeniable. Karen wasn't preserving the community, she was tormenting it. The HOA board was forced to act. A formal hearing was scheduled. Karen was instructed to step back from all enforcement duties until the investigation was complete. Her access to HOA documents, forms, and official channels was revoked. She was no longer allowed to issue citations or warnings, nor to represent the HOA in any official capacity. For someone who had built her identity around control, it was a crushing blow, but even stripped of her powers, Karen tried to rally support. She attempted to spin the narrative, claiming she was the victim of political retaliation, and that her only crime was trying to keep the neighborhood in order. But the community wasn't buying it anymore. People had seen enough. The calm, composed response from my wife had laid bare the contrast between real authority and Karen's performative power. The facade had crumbled. More damaging to Karen's credibility was the discovery of prior HOA documents that bore her personal edits violations reworded. Fines altered, board meeting notes changed after the fact. She had not only abused her position, she had manipulated records to make her actions appear legitimate. With evidence mounting, the HOA board had no choice but to initiate a formal motion for her removal. At the next general meeting, the vote was held. It wasn't even close. Karen was unanimously voted off the board. Her reign of control, intimidation, and pettiness officially ended that day. The community, once fractured under her rule, seemed to breathe collectively for the first time in years. Homeowners spoke more freely. Block parties resumed. Communication improved. The very fabric of the neighborhood, once tightly wound by fear, but justice didn't stop at her removal. The city's Neighborhood Relations Committee placed Karen on a public misconduct watch list for future HOA or community volunteer involvement. Her misuse of public services, false police report, and pattern of harassment meant that she could no longer participate in official neighborhood governance without full disclosure and oversight. Essentially, she was blacklisted from holding power in any similar capacity. Karen's name, once spoken with caution, became a warning and example of how unchecked authority in the hands of the wrong person could turn a peaceful neighborhood into a place of division and distress. But more importantly, her downfall became a testament to what happens when truth, patience, and real leadership confront arrogance and abuse. And at the center of that shift stood my wife, not just as the one Karen tried to humiliate. The one who restored order with dignity, law, and strength. What Karen meant as a weapon ended up being her undoing, and the community once held hostage by her control now stood free, stronger, and united because someone finally stood up to the bully and refused to back down. The day Karen was officially removed from the HOA board felt like a reset for the entire neighborhood. Her iron grip, once accepted as the norm, had been shattered not with vengeance, but with due process, transparency, and calm authority. The shift wasn't just organizational, it was emotional. People walked their dogs without glancing over their shoulders. Kids rode their bikes without being chased down for minor infractions. Conversations at the mailbox no longer carried whispers of fear, but instead the relief of liberation. But Karen's downfall wasn't the only story being told. As her name faded into the background, another name began to circulate with admiration. The new police chief. Not just for her title, but for the way she handled it all with professionalism, restraint, and resolve. Words were many used. Power to control, she had used hers to protect. And the distinction hadn't gone unnoticed. What began as a targeted act of harassment had transformed into a lesson in real leadership. It would have been easy to retaliate with emotion, to respond to Karen's attacks with fury. But my wife had chosen a different path. She didn't flex her badge to silence opposition. She followed protocol, documented facts, and let the truth speak louder than threats. And that's what earned her not just compliance, but respect. The city council sent a letter commending her for her handling of the situation. It highlighted the balance she had maintained between protecting her personal boundaries and fulfilling her civic responsibilities without conflict of interest. The letter was read aloud at the next city meeting, where several community members also spoke, thanking her for standing up not just for herself, but for every resident Karen had ever bullied into silence. One elderly couple stood up and shared, How they'd once been threatened with fines for installing a wheelchair ramp, Karen claimed was visually disruptive. A single mother told the story of how Karen tried to issue her a violation for hosting her son's birthday party in the front yard. These people now had a voice because someone had made it safe to speak out. The emotional toll Karen had inflicted had been deep, but not permanent. The HOA, under new leadership, began to repair the damage. Policies were updated to prevent any one member from holding unchecked authority. Anonymous complaints were banned. A resident advisory board was formed to review all citations before action could be taken. Transparency replaced secrecy, and cooperation replaced fear. For the first time, the HOA served its true purpose: to support the neighborhood, not to control it. Karen, meanwhile, retreated into quiet isolation. No more daily patrols, no more clipboard. Her manicured front lawn remained perfect, but behind the trimmed hedges and decorative wreaths was the silence of lost power. She had spent years building a reputation she thought was untouchable, only to lose it overnight by underestimating the very person she tried to bring down. As the months passed, the barn, once the center of the storm, stood peaceful and untouched by further complaints. Its renovations were completed. It was restored to its former charm, painted a classic deep red with white trim, a small plaque on the side honoring its century-old legacy. Children from the neighborhood were invited to tour it during a community event, where my wife and I donated a collection of local historical photos we had uncovered during our work. What had once symbolized division was now a symbol of community pride. My wife didn't seek the spotlight. She didn't parade her position, but people noticed. They saw how she handled pressure, how she stood tall when targeted, and how she never let personal attacks shift her commitment to fairness. Respect isn't something that can be demanded. It's something that's earned. And she had earned every bit of it. One neighbor left a thank you note in our mailbox. Another brought over baked goods. Others simply waved more often, stopped by to chat, and spoke with a warmth that hadn't existed before. The atmosphere had changed not just because Karen was gone, but because someone brave enough to face her had helped restore balance. The story of Karen's downfall wasn't about punishment, it was about principle. It wasn't a victory rooted in revenge, but in the simple truth that no one is above accountability. That positions of influence, whether in a homeowner's board or in uniform carry, a responsibility to serve, not controlled. Karen had tried to use the system to crush us, but in the end, the system, when led by the right people, had protected us instead. Her obsession with dominance had met its match not in louder voices or harsher threats, but in quiet strength, clear evidence, and lawful authority. And in that small neighborhood where fear once walked freely in daylight, peace returned, not because someone fought fire with fire, because someone chose to extinguish it with integrity.